The skipped dinner. The evening was meant to be grand, filled with flashing cameras, polished marble floors, and tables set with silver cutlery that sparkled under the golden lights. Leaders from across the world had flown in, diplomats and businessmen, whispered in corners. Journalists waited eagerly to capture every move. The air smelled of fine spices and expensive perfumes, a mix of tradition and power. Everyone expected this night to be remembered for its glamour, but instead, it would be remembered for one small quiet act that no one saw coming. The Prime Minister of India, known for his discipline and his strict schedule, was expected to be the star of the dinner. Seats had been arranged carefully, names written on cards with delicate ink. The chefs had prepared dishes with great care, each meal designed to honor the guests. The room buzzed with excitement, people waiting to shake hands, to be seen, to feel that they had shared a meal with the leader of the nation. Yet as the clock ticked closer to the start of the dinner, whispers began to rise. Some noticed the seat reserved for the Prime Minister was still empty. Some leaned toward each other, voices low, eyes darting around. Where was he? What could be more important than this dinner with the world's elite? As minutes passed, the whispers turned to speculation. Perhaps there was a sudden emergency, perhaps a diplomatic call, perhaps even a security issue. The journalists smelled a story, their pens ready, their cameras waiting to capture the Prime Minister's grand arrival. But no arrival came. Instead, an aide walked briskly to the center, whispering something to the organizers, and in moments, the truth began to spread, like fire through dry grass. The Prime Minister had chosen not to attend the dinner. He had quietly left the hall, walking past guards and protocol officers, slipping into a simple car that drove away into the night. And where did he go? He went to a modest room, away from the chandeliers and velvet curtains, where sat a woman who had never asked for the spotlight, who never wore silk or gold, whose hands bore the marks of years of simple household work. She was Sundar Pichai's mother. The moment stunned everyone. Some could not understand why the leader of the nation would skip a VIP dinner, why he would leave world leaders waiting, why he would ignore the plan so carefully made. But others felt something stir inside them. Respect, curiosity, a sense that perhaps this was no ordinary choice. It was a choice that carried meaning, a choice that carried humility. But to understand why this moment would touch the nation, why it would become a story repeated in homes, in schools, in small towns, and big cities, we need to go back. We need to step away from the glitter of the present and walk into the dusty streets of a small Indian town many years ago, where a young boy named Sundar lived with his family in a small house that carried big dreams. The house was simple, built, with walls that held the laughter of children and the quiet worries of parents. There was no air conditioning to soften the heat of summer, no car waiting outside to make life easy. There were long walks to school, evenings spent under a dim lamp, and mornings filled with the smell of tea boiling in the kitchen. Sundar's father worked hard. His mother managed the home with patience and strength, and together they taught their children that even if life was simple, dignity and respect were riches no one could take away. Sundar was quiet as a child, observant, always curious. He loved to ask questions that sometimes seemed small but revealed a sharp mind. He remembered phone numbers after hearing them once. He took apart radios just to see how they worked, and when he spoke, his words carried more thought than noise. His mother watched him carefully, often smiling when he disappeared into his books or when he sat near the window lost in thought, staring at the passing trains. Yet life was not easy. The family lived with limits, counting every rupee, stretching every coin. Sundar's father often sat late at night, bills spread out on the table, wondering how to provide more for his children, while his mother quietly adjusted the household budget, giving up small comforts so her children could have an extra notebook or a better meal. They dreamed silently, not of wealth or fame, but of giving their children opportunities that they themselves never had. As Sundar grew older, his curiosity turned into determination. He excelled in school, often surprising his teachers with his insights. But behind every achievement was the silent support of his mother, who stayed awake with him during exams, who encouraged him when he doubted himself, who reminded him gently that resilience was greater than talent. One day, after a Long week of exams, Sundar came home to find his father in deep thought, and his mother's face pale with worry. On the table lay a letter, unopened but heavy with meaning. Sundar's heart beat faster as he picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the words, and when he reached the end, his breath caught. He had been accepted. It was the kind of news that could change everything, the kind of opportunity that could open doors beyond imagination, the kind of dream that only a few could touch. But even as his heart filled with excitement, his eyes turned toward his parents, and he saw the weight in their expressions, because dreams come with a cost and sometimes the cost feels too high. The letter lay between them, glowing with promise, but also heavy with fear. And as silence filled the room, Sundar realized that this letter was not just about him, it was about his family, their sacrifices, their struggles, their resilience. And that night, as he tried to sleep, he wondered if he should let go of his dream to ease their burden, or if chasing his dream would one day honor the very sacrifices that had brought him this far. The choice was not clear, the path ahead was uncertain, and the next knock on their door would bring news that would test everything they believed in. The letter's promise, and the midnight visitor, the knock on the door that night was soft at first, almost hesitant, as though the person outside knew the family was in the middle of something heavy. Sundar's mother lifted her head, eyes still wet from quiet tears she had tried to hide from her children. His father rose slowly, the wooden chair creaking as he pushed it back. Sundar's heart raced. The letter of admission still lay open, on the table, its words glowing like fire in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. The knock came again, firmer this time. His father walked to the door, unbolted it, and pulled it open. Standing outside was a neighbor, a kind man who often shared stories in the evenings when the power went out. He was holding a small bag of vegetables, his clothes still dusty from work, his face lined with years of struggle. He stepped inside, sensing the tension, and his eyes quickly landed on the letter. The neighbor asked quietly what had happened, and Sundar's father explained, voice heavy with both pride and worry. His son had been admitted to one of the most prestigious institutions, a dream for any family, but the cost was far beyond what they could afford. The neighbor listened in silence, nodding, his eyes shifting between the hopeful boy and the worried parents. Then he said something simple but powerful. He said, "Sometimes dreams are bigger than our pockets, but that does not mean we let them die." Those words stayed with Sundar long after the neighbor left. He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the street. Outside, the barking dogs, the distant whistle of a train, the quiet murmur of voices fading into the night. His mind was full of images, his mother skipping meals so he could eat, his father walking miles in the heat to save bus fare, his teachers encouraging him when he doubted himself. He knew the admission was more than an opportunity. It was a test of everything they had lived for. Days passed, and with each passing day, the weight of the decision grew heavier. The family gathered around the letter again and again, discussing, calculating, worrying. Sundar's father spoke of loans, of borrowing from friends, of selling small possessions. His mother listened quietly, her heart torn between the fear of debt and the hope of her son's future. Sundar sat quietly, his hands folded, trying not to show how deeply his heart ached with both excitement and guilt. Finally, one evening, his mother took him aside. She spoke softly, her voice calm but firm. She told him that life had taught her one thing: sacrifices made for the right reasons never feel like losses. She reminded him of the times she had gone without new clothes so the children could have books, of the nights she had worked through sickness just to keep the household steady. She told him that his education was not just his dream, it was theirs too, and she would not allow fear to steal it away. Those words lit a fire in Sundar. He realized that his mother's strength was greater than his doubts. He promised himself that if he was given this chance, he would never waste it. He would work harder than ever. He would carry their sacrifices in his heart, and he would honor them with every step he took. Soon, preparations began. The family borrowed money, cut expenses, and gathered whatever they could. Sundar received second-hand luggage from a relative, old but sturdy. His father polished it carefully, while his mother folded clothes neatly inside, slipping in a small packet of snacks and a handwritten note that said simply, "Remember who you are and where you come from." Sundar touched the note again and again, as though it gave him strength. The day of departure arrived. The station was crowded, full of travelers carrying heavy bags and heavier stories. The smell of tea and coal smoke filled the air. Children ran along the platform. Vendors shouted their prices. Sundar stood with his parents, his heart caught between fear and hope. He was leaving behind everything familiar, stepping into a world he had only dreamed of. As the train pulled in with a loud screech, his mother held his face in her hands, her eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. She told him that no matter where he went, no matter how far he traveled, he must remain humble, he must treat people with kindness, and he must never forget the values that shaped him. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, saying little, but in his eyes Sundar saw a world of unspoken trust. The train began to move, and Sundar leaned out of the window, waving as his parents grew smaller and smaller in the distance. He carried their faces in his mind, their voices in his ears, their love in his heart. And as the train picked up speed, he felt both the weight of responsibility and the thrill of possibility. College was not what he expected. The buildings were massive, the students confident, the air filled with ambition. Sundar felt like a small fish in an ocean, unsure of his place. The classes were hard, the competition fierce. There were moments when he doubted himself, moments when he felt he did not belong. But each time he faltered, he remembered his mother's words, his father's silent faith, and the sacrifices that had carried him there. Still, the challenges grew heavier. The cost of books was high, the demands of study endless. Sundar often stayed up late, his eyes burning, his body tired, but his mind pushing forward. He lived simply, saving every coin, sharing meals with friends, sometimes skipping meals altogether, but beneath the struggles was a determination that refused to break. And then came the day of his first major setback. A project he had worked on for weeks, pouring his energy into every detail, was rejected. The professor dismissed it quickly, calling it incomplete, lacking depth. The words cut deep, leaving Sundar shaken. He returned to his small room that night, sitting on his narrow bed, staring at the walls. He wondered if he was truly meant to be there, if he had been foolish to dream so big. His friends laughed in the halls, the city buzzed outside, but Sundar sat in silence, his heart heavy. He thought of the train ride, of his mother's words, of the letter that had seemed like a golden key. Was he about to waste it all? And then, just as he was about to close his books and give in to despair, there was another knock on the door. The mentor and the burden of choice. The knock on the door was sharp, breaking the silence of Sundar's small hostel room. His eyes were heavy, his books scattered across the desk, and his spirit weighed down by disappointment. For a moment he thought of ignoring it, pretending he was asleep, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. With a sigh, he pulled himself up and opened the door. Standing there was one of his professors, a man known for his stern face and sharp words, someone Sundar had always respected but also feared. The professor's eyes studied him carefully, as though he had already guessed the storm inside the young student's heart. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and looked around at the small, plain room. He noticed the books, piled high, the bed unmade, the faint marks of exhaustion under Sundar's eyes. The professor asked him calmly why he had missed the study group that evening. Sundar hesitated, his voice faltering, before finally confessing that he was losing faith in himself. He admitted that he felt small among students who seemed smarter, wealthier, more confident. He confessed that his project's rejection had broken something inside him, that he felt maybe he did not belong here at all. The professor listened quietly, not interrupting, his eyes never leaving Sundar's face. And then he said something that would stay with Sundar for years. He told him that talent is important, but resilience is greater. He said failure is not the opposite of success, but the path to it. He reminded Sundar that the world does not reward those who never fall, but those who rise again and again. Those words entered Sundar's heart like a spark in the darkness. The professor encouraged him to try again, to rebuild the project, to learn from the mistakes instead of hiding from them. He said that every rejection was an invitation to grow, and that Sundar's humility and curiosity were his greatest strengths. For the first time in days, Sundar felt a flicker of hope. He thanked the professor, who nodded and left without further words. Sundar closed the door and leaned against it, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and renewed determination. He picked up his books again, his mind sharper, his will stronger. He promised himself that he would not quit. Not after all his family had given, not after his mother's sacrifices, not after the letter that had carried his dreams. The weeks that followed were hard. Sundar pushed himself relentlessly, staying up through the night studying until his eyes burned. He worked on his project again, carefully correcting every weakness, building it piece by piece with patience and effort. He faced challenges at every step, but instead of seeing them as walls, he began to see them as doors waiting to be opened. Slowly, his professors began to notice. They saw his dedication, his quiet strength, the way he carried himself without arrogance, always listening, always learning. His fellow students too began to respect him, not because he spoke the loudest or showed off, but because he worked silently, consistently, and with humility. Sundar was not the kind to chase the spotlight, but the spotlight had a way of finding him. Yet even as his academic journey grew stronger, another storm brewed quietly in his heart. The financial strain on his family had not disappeared. Every letter from home carried both love and worry, updates about money borrowed, about debts waiting, about his parents stretching themselves thin to support him. Sundar read those letters, with tears in his eyes, feeling the burden pressing harder on his shoulders. He wanted to help, but he knew his only way to truly lift them was to succeed, to make this struggle worth something. In his quiet moments, Sundar often thought of his mother. He remembered her words about sacrifices never being losses. He imagined her in their small kitchen, her hands busy with work, her heart silently praying for his success. Those thoughts gave him strength on nights when exhaustion threatened to break him. Then came another turning point. An opportunity arose for students to apply for a scholarship that could ease financial pressure. Sundar knew it would be life-changing if he could get it. But the competition was fierce, with hundreds of brilliant students applying. He hesitated, doubt creeping in again, but his professor reminded him of the same lesson. Resilience was greater than talent. He applied, pouring his heart into the essays, his mind into the interviews. He spoke honestly about his journey, about his family, about his mother's strength and his father's quiet sacrifices. He did not try to impress with big words. He simply spoke the truth, with humility. Days later, the results were posted. Sundar walked slowly to the notice board, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushed through the crowd of students, eyes scanning the list until he saw his name. For a moment he could not believe it. He blinked again and again, but his name remained there, shining among the winners. His body trembled with relief, his eyes filled with tears he tried to hide. He thought of his parents instantly, of how this would ease their burden, of how this victory belonged to them as much as it did to him. That evening, he wrote them a long letter, his handwriting messy, with emotion, telling them the good news. He knew that when his mother read it, her heart would dance with joy, even if her eyes filled with tears. But just as Sundar began to feel steady, life threw another challenge his way. While preparing for his next exams, he received a call from home. His father's voice was calm but heavy, carrying a weight that made Sundar's stomach twist. Something had happened, something serious, something that would force him to make a choice no young man should ever have to face. The choice between two worlds, the call from home lingered in Sundar's ears long after it ended. His father's voice had been steady, almost too steady, as if he was hiding something under a layer of calm. Sundar could tell immediately that things were not well. The family had always lived on the edge of financial struggle, but this time it was different. His father hinted at health concerns, at debts piling higher than before, at pressures from relatives who could not understand why the family was sacrificing so much for one son's education. Sundar sat on his narrow hostel bed, staring at the wall, the receiver still warm in his hand. He felt torn apart. Part of him wanted to pack his bag, to take the next train home, to stand beside his parents who had carried him this far. Another part of him knew that leaving now would mean giving up everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed. His dream was no longer his alone. It belonged to his parents, to his younger siblings, to everyone who believed in him. That night, he could not sleep. The ceiling above him seemed to press down. The silence of the hostel corridors felt too loud. He remembered his mother's voice, telling him to never forget where he came from, but also reminding him that sacrifices are never losses. He asked himself again and again, was his staying here another form of sacrifice for his parents, or was it selfishness? The next day, his professor noticed his distracted face in class. After the lecture, he called Sundar aside and asked what was troubling him. With hesitation, Sundar explained everything. The financial strain, the family's crisis, his guilt. The professor listened quietly, then told him something he had not expected. He said that sometimes helping the family does not mean returning physically. Sometimes the greatest help is to succeed so powerfully that the struggles of the present become meaningless in the future. Those words settled in Sundar's mind like a heavy truth. He realized that if he returned home now, he might provide comfort for a while, but he would be closing the door to the future his family dreamed of. If he stayed, if he fought harder, if he succeeded, he could one day lift them from these struggles forever. With renewed determination, Sundar decided to stay, but he carried the weight of his choice like a stone in his chest. Every letter he wrote home was filled with encouragement and love, but in the quiet of his heart he felt the ache of distance. His mother wrote back, her words always soft and full of faith, assuring him that he was doing the right thing, that their hardships were temporary, that his path was their hope. Time passed, and Sundar's journey through college shaped him in ways he could not have imagined. He grew stronger, not just academically but also emotionally. He became known not for arrogance but for humility, not for shouting the loudest but for thinking the deepest. His friends came to him for advice. His teachers respected his quiet discipline, and slowly he began to stand out, not as the loudest voice in the room, but as the one people trusted. After years of struggle, Sundar graduated with honors, and the next chapter of his life began. He earned a place at Stanford University in America, a dream that felt almost impossible for a boy from a modest Indian home. When the acceptance letter arrived, his parents were overwhelmed. His father smiled through tears. His mother held the letter close to her heart, whispering prayers of gratitude. But once again, the challenge of money rose like a mountain before them. The cost of studying abroad was beyond anything they could imagine. His father sold what he could, borrowed again, and made arrangements with the kind of quiet determination that only a parent's love can fuel. Sundar, too, contributed by working part-time, cutting every unnecessary expense, surviving on the simplest meals. The day he left for America was one of the hardest of his life. At the airport, his mother held him tightly, refusing to let go until the final call was announced. She whispered in his ear, telling him to remain humble no matter how high he rose. His father, as always, spoke little, but the way he gripped Sundar's shoulder told him everything words could not. Arriving in America was like stepping onto another planet. The streets were wide, the buildings taller than anything he had seen, the people confident and fast-paced. Sundar felt small again, just as he had when he first entered college in India. His accent marked him as different, his clothes marked him as modest, and his bank account reminded him every day that he was far from home. He struggled with loneliness in those early months. The food tasted strange, the nights were cold, and the silence of his small dorm room often felt unbearable. He missed the familiar sounds of home, the call of street vendors, the distant trains, the laughter of neighbors. He wrote long letters to his family, each one filled with love, but he rarely admitted how difficult things really were. He did not want to worry them. Yet, despite the challenges, Sundar kept moving forward. He impressed his professors with his curiosity, his ability to see problems differently, his quiet resilience. Classmates who once overlooked him began to notice his sharp mind, his ability to explain complex ideas with simplicity. His humility became his strength, his resilience, his guiding light. And just as he was beginning to find his place in America, Just as his hard work started to open doors, another call came from home. This time, the voice on the other end was not calm but heavy with urgency. Something had happened, something that shook the very foundation of his family. Sundar's heart pounded as he listened, his hands trembling around the receiver. The choice he had faced once before now returned with even greater force. Stay and chase the dream his family had sacrificed everything for, or return to a home that desperately needed him now more than ever. Crisis, sacrifice, and the road to recognition. The call from India came late at night. Sundar was in his small room at Stanford, surrounded by stacks of books and scribbled notes. When the phone rang, the sound startled him, and as soon as he picked it up, he heard his younger brother's voice trembling on the other end. Their father had fallen ill. The details were rushed, words spilling with panic. But the message was clear. The family was struggling more than ever, and they needed him. Sundar sat in silence after the call ended, his heart pounding. He closed his eyes and saw his father sitting at the small wooden table back home, his tired face bent over bills, his hands worn from years of work. He saw his mother, holding the family together with quiet strength, hiding her tears behind smiles. He felt the weight of the oceans between them, the cruel distance that kept him from being at their side. That night, he walked outside into the cold California air. The streets were quiet, the stars above bright, yet he felt alone in a way that pierced deeper than ever before. For the first time since arriving in America, he seriously considered leaving it all behind, his studies, his opportunities, his dream, and returning home to be with his family. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. He knew if he returned, he would bring them peace, but he would also close the doors that had cost them so much to open. His parents had given everything for him to reach this place, and he wondered if going back now would turn their sacrifices into wasted years. The choice tore at him. Days turned into weeks of inner conflict. Sundar wrote letters home, promising his father he would stay strong, telling his mother that he would not let her sacrifices go in vain. He studied harder, but the worry never left his heart. His professors noticed his distracted eyes, his tired face, and one of them gently reminded him again of the lesson he had first learned in India. Resilience was greater than talent. Through the storm of guilt and fear, Sundar found a new kind of strength. He told himself that the best way to serve his family was not to abandon his dream, but to fulfill it. He promised himself that one day he would build a life where his parents would never have to worry again. That promise became his fuel. Time moved forward, and with it, Sundar's reputation grew. At Stanford, he was not the loudest student, nor the most flamboyant, but he was the one who thought deeply, who listened, who explained with humility. Professors respected him, classmates trusted him. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that drew people to him. Eventually, Sundar's journey brought him to Google, a company that was then growing fast, filled with bright minds from around the world. At first, he felt once again like the boy from a small town, lost in a sea of confident voices. But he reminded himself of the lessons that had carried him this far: hard work, humility, resilience. Inside Google, Sundar faced new challenges. Projects were demanding, expectations high, and competition fierce, but he approached each challenge with calm persistence. He never tried to outshine others. Instead, he focused on solving problems, on building tools that made people's lives easier. Colleagues noticed his clarity, his kindness, the way he lifted others rather than pushing them down. His work on the Chrome browser became a turning point. Many doubted it in the beginning, questioning whether the world needed another browser, but Sundar believed in its potential. He worked tirelessly, guiding his team with patience and vision. When Chrome finally launched, it changed the way millions experienced the internet. People began to see Sundar not just as another engineer, but as a leader with foresight. Recognition followed, but Sundar remained the same humble man he had always been. He still wrote letters home, still reminded himself of his mother's words, still carried the image of his father's sacrifices in his heart. Yet just as success began to lift him higher, life tested him again. One day, as opportunities for greater leadership opened before him, Sundar received news that shook him deeply. A choice stood before him, one that could cost him everything he had built. If he accepted the role being offered, he would enter a world of immense responsibility, endless pressure, and relentless scrutiny. If he refused, he would remain safe. But he might lose the chance to create the impact he had always dreamed of. Sundar sat alone late into the night, staring at the quiet glow of the city lights outside his window. He remembered the letter that had changed his life, the train ride to college, the knock on his hostel door, the flight to America, the nights of hunger, the moments of doubt. He remembered his mother's words about humility and resilience, and he knew that whichever path he chose next, it would shape not just his own life but the future of millions. The return, the respect, and the moment that touched the nation. The night before Sundar had to give his decision, he sat alone in his room. Papers were spread across his desk, his phone filled with unread messages, but he ignored them all. He thought instead about the long road that had brought him here, the dust-filled streets of his childhood town, the small house filled with sacrifices, the long train rides, the quiet tears of his mother, the strength of his father, the nights of hunger, the letters of encouragement, the failures, the small victories. He felt the weight of every step pressing on him, and yet it was that very weight that gave him the courage to rise. When the morning came, he walked into the room where his future waited. Executives, leaders, decision-makers. All eyes turned to him. The offer on the table was not just a role, it was a responsibility that would define the path of technology in people's lives for years to come. Sundar listened carefully, his mind steady, his heart remembering the lessons of humility. And then, with a calm voice, he said, "Yes." That yes changed everything. From that moment, Sundar's rise was unstoppable. His leadership guided teams, his vision shaped products, and his humility won respect across the world. He never sought the spotlight, yet the spotlight found him, illuminating his journey from a modest Indian home to the highest levels of one of the world's most powerful companies. But despite the success, Sundar never forgot his roots. He never forgot the small kitchen where his mother had whispered words of courage, the nights his father had stayed awake worrying about bills, the sacrifices that had paved his way. And that is why, years later, when he returned to India as one of the most influential leaders in the world, his focus was not on showing power or fame, but on honoring the people who had made him who he was. The visit was grand. Cameras flashed, crowds gathered, leaders stood waiting. The schedule was packed with dinners, speeches, and meetings with some of the most important people in the country. Yet, in the middle of it all, one moment stood out. A moment that would be remembered across the nation. On that evening, a VIP dinner had been arranged. The tables were laid with elegance, the guest list filled with powerful names. But just as the dinner was about to begin, whispers spread once again. The Prime Minister would not be attending. People were confused, some frustrated, others curious. But the truth soon became clear. Instead of attending the lavish event, the Prime Minister had chosen to spend time in a small room nearby, sitting quietly with Sundar Pichai's mother. There, she was, the woman who had once stayed awake by a dim lamp so her son could study, the woman who had given up comforts so he could chase dreams, the woman who had endured years of worry with patience and grace. She sat humbly, her sari simple, her smile shy, her hands folded, and opposite her sat the leader of the nation, speaking to her with respect, listening to her stories, honoring her sacrifices. When the news reached the hall, hearts stirred. Journalists wrote about it, citizens discussed it, and people across India felt a wave of emotion. It was not the glamour of the dinner that touched them, but the quiet dignity of the moment. The Prime Minister's choice was more than an act of courtesy. It was a recognition of the values that build a nation. Respect for mothers, for sacrifice, for humility. For Sundar, the moment was almost overwhelming. As he watched from a distance, he felt his eyes fill with tears. He thought of his childhood, of the letter on the table, of the knock on the door, of the train that carried him away, of the phone calls that had shaken him. of the nights when he wanted to quit. And now here he was, standing in a room filled with world leaders. Yet his heart was with the simple woman whose love and resilience had made everything possible. That night, when he spoke later to the audience, his voice was calm, but heavy with emotion. He did not speak of technology or success. Instead, he spoke of humility, of kindness, of resilience, of the values his parents had given him. He reminded everyone that greatness is not about titles or wealth, but about staying true to where you come from and lifting others with respect. The hall was silent as he finished. People felt something deeper than admiration. They felt connected, inspired. Many left that evening not just talking about Sundar's success, but about the power of a mother's sacrifice, about the importance of humility, about the meaning of respect. And so the story traveled across the nation, from the smallest villages to the busiest cities. It was told in schools, in homes, in offices. Parents told their children about Sundar's mother. Teachers spoke of resilience. Leaders reflected on humility. It was a story that reminded everyone that behind every great achievement lies the quiet strength of ordinary people. And Sundar himself, despite all his success, carried that lesson in his heart every single day. He never forgot the night of the skipped dinner, the night when the nation was touched not by wealth or power but by respect, humility, resilience, and kindness.